Hey, Dr. Joe here at Atlas Health, and continuing on 100 videos in 100 days, day 14. And I'm wearing the exact same thing as yesterday, so thanks for noticing. I'm not actually going forward in time by creating a video the day before or anything. So anyway, I want to share with you one of my favorite tests. It's a test called Cyrex Array 4, and Cyrex Labs is pretty cool. They do testing on something called predictive antibodies. And so what an antibody is, for those of you that are brand new to this, is, let's say like I'm a bacteria, right? And a white blood cell comes up to the bacteria and identifies it as a bacteria. It might take a chunk of it and then go back to the lymph nodes and then talk to other white blood cells, and then those white blood cells direct an attack against the bacteria, and one of the white blood cells can develop into what's called a B cell, which makes antibodies, and the antibodies are released from the bacteria or from the white blood cell, and it attaches to the bacteria, and then other white blood cells now are more deadly at killing it. That's what an antibody does, okay? It's called opsonization. And so basically, a lot of people out there have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, or they have straight up celiac disease. Celiac disease is a situation in which the small intestine gets destroyed by our own white blood cells due to a significant genetic sensitivity to gluten, okay? A lot of people, though, have what's called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which means they don't have the specific celiac genes or the celiac version of autoimmunity attacking their small intestine, but what they have is they have an immune system that has made antibodies to gluten, okay? So like if I was to do a little share screen here, basically what that means is that, let's say like this is a stomach, and gluten comes in here, all right? Gluten comes in the stomach, we'll just call it G. But gluten actually looks like this. It has A, B, D, and L, okay? So like the constituents of gluten are these amino acid sequences, right? That's what it looks like when it's broken down into its code, okay? Well, gluten goes into the small intestine down here. And basically what ends up happening in the small intestine is it's not broken down into its constituents, so it's still floating around A, B, D, and L, right? It's still floating around like that. So what happens is there's white blood cells that are kind of hanging out in the interstitial space here, outside of the intestine, but like in the area just outside. It's called the gut associated lymphatic tissue, and it can dock antibodies onto these proteins that are glued together, okay? Remember that antibody is the opsonization that causes other white blood cells to come in and get it. So now what happens is, instead of having a food protein that your body absorbs and uses for like nourishment, it ends up becoming a pro-inflammatory food. That's a big problem, right? Because that inflammation was the cover of Time magazine like over a decade ago. It's the silent killer. It's kind of the mechanism of several different known degenerative disease processes, or all of them. So if the stomach does a good job breaking gluten down into like its components, instead of being like all those lined up, A, B, D, L, if it's like A is over here, B is over here, D is over here, L is over here, it's like if those things happen, basically if gluten here is still in the small intestine glued together, the immune system over here will make a reactivity to it. Now, this process doesn't involve this guy just like making antibodies. That's kind of a very oversimplified diagram. But this guy, what he does is he goes to the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes then send back other cells that produce antibodies, and those antibodies will target anything that they get to go ahead to target by these guys, okay? There's ways you can stop that from happening, or slow that down at the level of the lymph node, but essentially this is what a food sensitivity is. Okay, now the issue is that this gluten is not amino acids, it's still gluten, okay? And so this inflammatory response can cause a lot of local inflammation at the level of the intestine, but it can also cause systemic inflammation. That's the root of most degenerative issues. One of the videos I made the other day was how this can create a specific joint inflammation. And so this person could have chronic joint pain due to secondary cross-reactivity from gluten here to like joints or like pork or dairy, things like that, okay? So what if, though, the person stopped eating gluten, okay? Okay, instead they ate dairy, okay? So maybe say dairy looks like this, A, C, D, L, okay? So that's core level, the amino acid sequence is that, right? So this is a match, this is a match, this is a match, this is not a match. But it's close enough, right? So this person might avoid gluten, and so they don't have the gluten thing happening down here, okay? But instead, they have dairy down here, okay? Dairy comes in here. It's gonna look like this, A, C, D, L. Now, this guy over here has already signaled the alarm. Right here, he signaled the alarm for this, but based on gluten. But it's so close, now dairy also becomes a target. See what happens? So one of my favorite tests of all time, okay, is for people that know they have a gluten sensitivity and they've avoided gluten, and they're like, man, I stopped eating gluten and I didn't get any better at all. Like nothing happened basically. I'm like, what'd you start eating? Well, I ate more corn, I had a little more rice. They just basically substitute one grain for another. Maybe they started having more like cheese, things like that, okay? Or they just started eating like quinoa or like amaranth or spelt, maybe things that are non-gluten containing, but they started eating an abundance of that, right? So if we kind of look at this test that I was talking about, Cyrex Array 4, it's really cool. So Cyrex Array 4 can run antibodies to see if your body's producing antibodies to these gluten-containing or gluten-contaminated grains. So sadly, instant coffee often is contaminated with gluten. Rye, barley, spelt, Polish wheat, okay? So these are like gluten-containing grains that a lot of times people don't know have gluten, okay? To see if your body's making antibodies against those and perpetuating inflammation, depression, hypothyroidism, you know, diabetes, dementia, you know, you name it, you know, basically anything that's linked to degeneration, right? So these are gluten cross-reactive foods. So that diagram I just drew where the dairy can look like the gluten, okay, this is milk, this is cheese, this is another type of, this is the addictive, like the happy part of cheese, this is butter, this is milk protein, this is milk chocolate, this is yeast, which is in a lot of different leavened things or alcohols, like kombucha, for example, depending on who makes it. Oats, millet, rice, and corn. So all of these things could look just like gluten. So a person could go gluten-free and they're like, man, I know I need to go gluten-free. I believe the data. I know that I'm not feeling well. It seems to be worse after I eat something that contains gluten. I've avoided gluten and I'm still getting these symptoms. I don't know what to do. We run this test and a person may have cross-reactivity to milk, but not cross-reactivity to casein. Meaning when they have milk, they have the reaction, but then they have reaction to cheese, but it's the exact same as if they have gluten. So if they get vertigo when they eat gluten, they get vertigo when they eat cheese still. But they went gluten-free, but they didn't stop eating cheese, and so now they still have this response. You see what I'm saying? This test down here, this part of the test looks at a bunch of things that people eat when they aren't gluten-free anymore. And so at the level of the intestine, so let me go through the list here. Buckwheat, sorghum, hemp, sesame, amaranth, quinoa, tapioca, teff, and potato, right? So sometimes people will go gluten-free and they'll start eating more potatoes. Okay. Well, what's the deal with potatoes? Okay, well, did you know potato not only cross-reacts with gluten, but potato also cross-reacts with insulin? with GAD65, which is necessary to make GABA, okay, and with thyroid hormone. Okay, so here's a person with anxiety or diabetes. Okay, here's a person with hypothyroidism potentially. Here's a person that can't stand latex. They can't stand latex paints, latex gloves. They have a latex sensitivity, so they can't use latex condoms for birth control, right? And then corn, right? So this person didn't show positive on corn, but they showed positive on white potato. And they also, wouldn't you know it, have a latex issue. They really do bad when they eat nachos, even with there's no cheese on it. They have anxiety, okay, and they also have all these thyroid symptoms, even though they've been told their lab tests are normal, right? And by the way, they might not even show a potato sensitivity on a potato test, because this isn't asking necessarily if it's a IgG or IgA only. There's also different types of antibodies. So this testing looks at IgG and IgA antibodies. So you might catch something that would be missed on another test, okay? So now here's a person who's like, man, I have some gluten sensitivity. I know it's linked to my hypothyroidism because I have symptoms of thyroid disturbance when I eat more gluten. I'm gonna start eating more potatoes because I'm gonna have hash browns instead of like toast for breakfast. And they do worse, okay? And not only do they have like the gluten symptoms, okay, but now they have the symptoms of low thyroid function, of blood sugar disturbance, and their allergies might get kicked up from that immune reactivity. So this is one of my favorite tests, like I was saying. I love this test because so many people have identified food as an issue for them, but then they restrict to that one or two foods, and then they actually do worse. And the question is, why is that? And this test gives us a lot of information as to why. Now, what's the solution? Well, the trap would be to say the only solution would be just to avoid more food. So now avoid potato or avoid cheese in this scenario because they have these two tests as well. And you saw that potato cross-reacted with corn, so now they need to avoid like corn. And that might be true in the short term, but the ultimate goal is to reestablish oral tolerance. And so if you're new to the concept of oral tolerance, we have a ton of videos here on oral tolerance, so go check them out. And that's a little bit about one of my favorite tests called Cyrix-Array-4 and its relationship to chronic conditions specifically related to diet and food, and why maybe those aren't resolving for you. So hopefully that's helpful, and you can get some good dialogue going with your clinician to help getting that answer that you need to get to your healthcare goal. Have a good evening.